Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
They're gonna put me in the movies.
This is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano, and if you've listened to this program for any length of time, you probably know that what I'm about to share with you is true. If you ever read a headline that begins, Frank Morano murdered by wife, or if it doesn't even have to be my name, maybe around the country some people don't necessarily know me, it may say radio talk show host murdered by wife. The reason my wife will have murdered me will definitely not have anything to do with any sort of rebelling against any sort of domestic violence, won't have anything to do with infidelity or drugs or anything like that. It will absolutely be because our house is being overrun with books. I already have more books than I can read in a lifetime, and I'm acquiring them at a much faster pace than I can read them. I am now hiding books in different rooms all across the house, inevitably knowing that my wife is going to find these books hidden in these different places and totally freak out, and it's going to lead to a big argument. And yet, I still can't help myself. I feel some sort of a compulsion to keep acquiring books. And you might imagine that when I pass a bookstore, that to me is a moth to a flame. I can't resist going in. Usually I can't resist purchasing anything, but whether I'm purchasing something or not, you can bet there is going to be some serious browsing going on. And that's why I was so interested in Evan Friss and his newest book, The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it. If you're not familiar with Dr. Evan Friss, he is an associate professor of history at James Madison University. He is a scholar of American and urban history and a New York Times best-selling author whose latest book is The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. Dr. Evan Friss, thanks so much for joining me on the radio.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be on.
So, why write about the bookstore? You've written about history before. You've studied many different aspects of urban history. What inspired you to pick the history of the bookstore?
Well, I was intrigued by, in some ways, the decline in the number of bookstores that happened over the course of my own lifetime. And my wife got a job when I was in graduate school in New York at a small independent shop in the West Village of Manhattan called 3 Lives. And it was really through that experience that I began to realize how important bookstores could be. I had always been a big reader and was reading a lot in graduate school and very much appreciated books, but wasn't really the kind of person who hung out in bookstores. But then through her, I met a lot of people who did and began to realize how important bookstores could be as anchors of community, how important they are in helping us find books that we wouldn't have found otherwise. And frankly, how many people, like you just mentioned, just revel in browsing bookstores and that kind of sensory experience, which seemed to be under some threat.
Let's talk about the threat. Obviously, I imagine part of that threat is from online book retailers like Amazon. And look, there can be a lot to be said for Amazon. If there's a book that I can't find anywhere, I could go on to Amazon. Chances are, even if it's out of print, they will find me a new or a used copy of that book. It'll be sent to me within a couple of days at a pretty good price, and it'll have recommendations on the bottom of the page saying, oh, customers who bought this also bought this, and this. Oh, I'm interested in that. Why is the sensory experience, in your judgment, of perusing a bookstore superior to the convenience and variety of shopping on the internet?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the internet offers a lot of advantages, and throughout American history, much of the population has not lived near an independent bookstore. So having Amazon really democratized access and brought books everywhere. That said, the experience of browsing in person is very distinct from online, and people are typically several times more likely to find a book that they wouldn't have found otherwise. So it's a great place for discovery. Of course, there's the kind of human interaction and conversation that can happen between bookseller and customer. And a lot of it's just a physical sensation that being surrounded by books is warm and comforting and joyous.
Give us a thumbnail sketch of the history of the bookstore in America. I guess all of us may think of bookstores as always having been there, but I guess Ben Franklin and George Washington didn't walk out of their house and find a bookstore down the block. When did bookstores become a thing in American history?
Yeah, so at first of all, most colonial Americans were illiterate, so there wasn't a big market, and the elite generally imported their books from Europe individually and through sort of private agents. But Ben Franklin himself was so disappointed that there weren't people selling books that he jumped into the business himself. And he opened one of the first and most remarkable bookstores in Philadelphia that was also a print shop, a post office, a place where newspapers were delivered, and it was multifunctional, but it was also a place where he sold a lot of books. So those colonial shops tended to be part bookstore, part many other things. And then by the 19th century, the 1820s and 30s, we have the birth of what I would call modern American bookstores. And one of the hallmarks were that these were browsable spaces where people could hang out, congregate, find books, talk about books, and buy them. And people began to appreciate books as material objects. And then pushing farther into the late 19th and early 20th century, bookstores began to expand. We had some chain bookstores and publisher-owned bookstores. And then throughout the 20th century, lots of different kinds of bookstores, specialty shops, department stores were large retailers of books for much of the 20th century, activist shops, and then, of course, the superstores in the late 20th century like Barnes & Noble, and then the online giants that changed the landscape, particularly Amazon, in the 21st century.
At 30 minutes after the hour, this is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. My guest is Evan Friss. We're chatting about his book, The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. You mentioned those bookstores, Barnes & Noble and Borders. I used to go to those bookstores once in a while. I always felt a little guilty whenever I would walk in, but I still would end up going in there because they also had a great book selection. They also had very comfortable chairs, and they wouldn't care if you sat in there all day for 4 or 5 hours reading all the books and not necessarily buying any of them. As it stands now in 21st century America in 2024, how is the bookstore marketplace divided between those Barnes & Noble style shops and the smaller independent shops like the one that your wife worked for?
Yeah, so they're a lot more similar than they used to be in the 90s when superstores became popular and Barnes & Noble and Borders were unfurling across the country. small independents like to differentiate themselves from those corporate booksellers. And frankly, they had wars, lawsuits, and all sorts of legal battles and publicity campaigns that spun them as rivals, and of course, popularized in the movie You've Got Mail. But since many of the bookstores, including the chains, have been battered and borders closed, what's happened is that Barnes & Noble and the so-called mom and pop shops or indie shops have rallied together to try and save brick and mortar bookselling. And for the most part, they're rooting each other on and hoping that we still have actual physical bookstores in the years to come. And to some degree are supporting each other, certainly much less rivals than they once were.
Though that's encouraging, I suppose. So I did read an article not long ago that bookstores were making something of a comeback after the boom of online booksellers. Is that true?
Yeah, so there's been long declines in the number of bookstores, especially on a per capita basis. And there were many reasons to predict the end of brick and mortar bookselling with the rise of Amazon, with the rise of ebooks and Kindle, and more recently audiobooks. But one of the interesting things that happened is those markets kind of plateaued and the decline slowed down. And in the last year or two, there's actually been a small uptick in the number of bookstores. So we don't have nearly the number to rival the number of bookstores that there were 30 years ago or even 20 years ago. But there are encouraging signs that at least the decline has ended. And there's been a lot of optimism about the return of reading in general, and book sales skyrocketed during the pandemic, which was a boon for not just Amazon, but also the brick and mortar booksellers, even though they had to briefly pivot to online sales, and when they opened had to adhere to various rules that limited the number of events and those kinds of things.
You mentioned that there has been a decline even with that modest comeback in the number of bookstores. What kind of a decline are we talking about? How many bookstores were there at the apex of bookstores in America versus how many are there these days?
Yeah, so several times as many bookstores per capita 100 years ago than there were today. There were even more booksellers per capita during the Civil War era than there are today, and thousands have closed since the 1990s. And at first, it was Barnes & Noble and Borders that were often blamed for these closures, even though there were, varied reasons. And then, of course, the rise of Amazon. And it's always been a difficult business, even from the very beginning. It's never been a very high margin business. The products that they sell are not unique. It's not like some kind of, boutique retailer or clothing place that has some product that you can't get elsewhere. And the prices are determined by the publishers themselves. So as costs increase, whether those are rent or labor, it can be difficult and has been historically for booksellers. So low margin businesses with skyrocketing rents in affluent neighborhoods where they tend to do best has always made for a kind of precarity, and has made for a difficult business generally.
Got it. If folks are just tuning in, I'm Frank Morano. You're listening to The Other Side of Midnight. My guest is Dr. Evan Friss. His book is all about bookstores. It's called The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookshop. You mentioned that people feel differently about their bookstore than they do about other stores. What do you think gives bookstores this almost sacred place in people's hearts, especially in a time when a lot of folks are purchasing books online?
I think a lot of it has to do with the product. So you mentioned near kind of sacred sentiment that people have about bookstores, and a lot of that has to do with our feeling about books themselves. And based on your intro, as a book lover, I suspect that it would be difficult for you to toss a book in the trash.
Oh, I get physically ill when I have to do that.
Exactly. So there's some, again, near kind of Holy Spirit that books have a hold on at least many of us. And walking into a bookstore can feel like walking into a church or some other kind of place of worship where it just feels so impressive and wondrous and powerful because we're drawn to these objects. And of course, we're just as humans drawn to stories. So being surrounded by a kind of temple of books can really be a kind of almost transcendent experience, and one that makes us physically feel something, often comfort, often warmth, and is something I think we've long valued, but in our busy 21st century digital world, I think many people also especially appreciate if we can just take a moment and sigh and sort of take it all in.
You write about bookstores serving as community hubs, especially for marginalized groups. In today's polarized climate, do you see independent bookstores reclaiming this space, or are they more vulnerable than ever?
I think it's hard. Bookstores have always been political spaces to some degree in terms of, what books the booksellers are going to carry and what they're not. And there have been many bookstores that have been the center of various civil rights campaigns and other kind of activist groups. And in today's landscape where everything is political, I think it's even harder to operate without being branded as something, which can make all the choices booksellers make very difficult, but also very public. But they still can be community spaces and are important community spaces that can be welcoming of at least large groups of people. And when groups of people come together to listen to someone reading from a novel, or a bunch of kids are sitting on the floor listening to story time, those are just great experiences that are still happening every day and every weekend in bookstores around the country. And they bring communities together, gathering people in ways that just frankly aren't all that common anymore.
Well, what a good point. And, in listening to you talk about bookstores, it's bringing me back to the way I hear fans of old school radio, which I'm one, talk about listening to terrestrial radio versus satellite radio, podcasts, etc. And a lot of these folks get very upset when their favorite radio station, no matter the format, could be talk, could be news, could be whatever, when their favorite radio station flips formats or goes dark. It's especially a big problem in rural areas and outside of big cities. But a lot of these radio stations that end up essentially shutting down, they weren't making money. They weren't bringing in ratings. And your book navigates the tension between bookstores as these places of magic and their economic struggles. Do you think that bookstores are now destined to exist more as cultural institutions or nostalgic relics rather than, say, a viable business?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there have been recently many more bookstores that have tried to change their model, and some that have adopted, in fact, a nonprofit status, that have pitched themselves as cultural institutions that have some greater purpose and aren't necessarily motivated by the bottom line. That's still a relatively small segment of the book selling landscape, but I think it does speak to something. It also speaks to how hard it can be to turn a profit. But there's always been a tension between how can you be a bookseller who, promotes disseminating literature, sharing stories, bringing people together, and taking a kind of high road about the importance of education and reading, but also pushing sales. And there is this tension. And I even in the book say that the kind of phrase, the book business, is often read as an oxymoronic kind of phrase for many people. because, again, books have these kind of holy spirit. And then when we put a barcode on them and an ISBN number, it can feel very transactional. And it's a difficult tension to navigate, and one that booksellers have long struggled with. But at the end of the day, if they are going to make a difference, if they are going to be players in the community, they need to stick around. So they need to figure out a way how to make a buck.
I appreciate you being so generous with your time, and I'll let you go in a second. But I do have to ask you, some might argue that your book, while it is definitely comprehensive, paints an overly nostalgic view or an overly idealistic view of bookstores. How would you respond to critics who feel that the decline of bookstores is sort of just a natural evolution of commerce?
Well, I think I'm not sort of making, in some ways, an argument against those people and everybody. I'm not somebody in general who thinks we need to keep institutions around because they're old or that they just have some kind of history. But I do think bookstores have generally had a positive influence in bringing books to the public, which is important. But I do in the book also try and explain that it's not all rosy. And so I have a chapter about the rise of Nazi bookstores in the United States, which frankly, they operate like some other activist bookstores that we might be more sympathetic to, but they hold many of the same beliefs about the power of the bookstore, that this is a place where you can disseminate knowledge and where you can sort of educate people. Now, in their mind, it was, proselytizing people toward Nazism, which is something we all have a disdain for and can see, but it was also a kind of acknowledgement.
Evan, that is such a good point, and one that I would absolutely never have thought of. All right, I'm sorry that we're out of time. I do hope people check out your book, and they could certainly check out your website, which is very simply just evanfriss.com. That's evanfriss.com. And if you search Evan Friss on Amazon or wherever books are sold, you can not only check out this book, but a bunch of Evan's other writings as well. Great stuff. I'd love to hear from you. If you want to comment on any portion of our conversation, feel free to do so at 646-720-0635. That's 646-720-0635. This is The Other Side of Midnight. Straight ahead.